I was born in Fruita, Colorado on April the 27th, 1938. I like to kid people and tell them that I was, my parents, Ernest Justin Turner and Clara Austin, were married on April the 12th, and my sister, Patsy Arlene, was born on April the 22nd, and I was born on April the 27th. And consequently, however, we were actually all 1 year apart. So they were married in 1936, and Patsy was 37 and I was 38. Ernest Turner, my dad, was born in 1896, and also in Fruita. The family owned a home on the corner of Colson and Otley, which was just recently removed for parking lot for the hospital. And my parents were married in 1892 in Fruita, Colorado. So the story begins with my grandfather, James Denny Turner, and he was born in 1854. So when you think of 1854, I like to review the fact that that was before Abraham Lincoln was office and presidency, and that the Civil War hadn't begun at that time. So during the Civil War, he would have been 6 years old. So you kind of get an idea of the background and the experience of an individual. I've many times wondered what his life would have seemed like in a conflict where they were living actually in the southwestern part of Missouri, which was a border state, meaning that it was the Confederates on one side and the on the northern side. And during the beginning of the Civil War, their homes were ransacked, burned. Young boys were killed because of the fact that they would be future warriors, and consequently, being where they were located, the Turner family, which had been in the far south originally, I traced them clear down into southern part of South Carolina, and so all of their life had been in the southern part of the country. So they were obviously in the Confederacy. And my great-grandmother made the boast that she had 6 sons, which were all of the sons older than my granddad, that fought for the South. And during the conflict, my great-grandmother ended up taking my granddad and his younger brother and a daughter and the in-laws, the girls, and they fled to Pilot Point, Texas, which is where after the war, they all congregated in Pilot Point and then moved back up to Missouri. So now we'll move on through the story to the travels coming to Colorado. So my family ended up moving then to Colorado, led by Nathan Jasper, which would have been a brother of my granddad, which was 17 years older, and he had moved to Colorado in 1875. So he was a resident of the territory before it became a state in 1876, and then my grandfather trailed, which I think probably were his cattle, along with several cousins, to Levita, Colorado, Gardner, Colorado, and the Walsenburg area in 1877. And they continued then in that area until 1885, at which time then my granddad headed west again. And again, I think they're probably mostly Nathan Jasper, his brother's cattle, but this family proclaimed that they trailed him from Levita to Grand Junction, Colorado in 1885. Fortunately, Grandpa and his sweetheart then, Meddy, which Meddy still was in Levita, and they would write letters back and forth. And over a period of 7 years, so from 1885 until 1892, there accumulated, or there remained, because Grandma saved all of her letters, but Grandpa didn't do too well out on the range. And but there was a composite of about 90 letters that I have that I have transcribed, putting them on a current day computer. The word check, it really had a fit with, because I tried to leave it spelled like just the way it was. And I think he probably had a third or fourth grade education, so some of the spelling just wasn't, it was more sound than it was spelling. But anyway, his first letter in the valley would have been in September 17th, 1885, at which time he made the comment in the letter. He said that they swam the cattle across the Grand River, and some of the boys went into a little town called Grand Junction. And then they ended up then proceeding from there on across the valley into Westwater, seemed to be the destination. And then the cattle were moved up onto Meadow Creek, up on the Book Cliffs. And so the range ended up being in that particular area. I questioned whether or not he actually trailed them all the way. He wrote letters all the time, and there wasn't any letters from Gunnison or any of the area through there, because that would have been where the narrow gauge railroad came from Levita over Marshall Pass down into the Black Canyon. And from the Black Canyon, they realized that they weren't going to do too well with the railroad down there, so they ended up coming up in the around Sabanero, the Cimarron River, and then up over the Blue and into Montrose Delta and into Grand Junction. And I heard from another pioneer family in Fruita, and their granddad had been an engineer on the railroad, and he said that people didn't trust the bridge to hold the train, so even passengers would get off on the other side of the river and then walk across the bridge into Grand Junction, which I thought was ironic. And I thought, well, if they didn't think it could hold the people, I'm certain they wouldn't think it would hold all a trailer or a train load of cattle. So I felt like, and I still think, that he probably railed them to Grand Junction on the south side of the river, and then after the confluence of the Gunnison and the Grand River, then they would have swam them across the river. So it ended up in that area. He made the comment in one of the letters that he probably wouldn't be able to write too often because it was 50 miles to the nearest post office. So when he got to Westwater, he was indicating that there wasn't enough of a community, or a post office maybe even, for Fruita yet, so he would have to ride all the way into Grand Junction. And at the time, he said that Westwater was a community consisting of Chinese and Mexicans that were working on the railroad. They were working on the Ruby Canyon area. And then I have letters, when he was thrilled to death, one of the letters he comments that thank goodness now they have a post office. So they have a post office in Westwater. And so many of the little letters that I have, which are about that big, and they are postmarked out of Westwater, Utah, and others are out of Cisco. And then one of his sweetheart's sisters ended up moving to Fruita. And at the time, Fruita was starting to build, and he commented many times going in to seeing Ellen and Jed, and wishing that it was Meddy, that his sweetheart was there rather than her sister. So that was dating in the period of 1886, 1887, and through that period of time. So it was a long journey. He talked of the difficulty in the area, the remoteness of it, and one letter he commented. He said he was sorry, but he didn't. One of the boys that worked there at the ranch was going to go into town, and he couldn't wait for him to finish the letter. And he had one of the Ute Indians came along and interrupted him because he wanted to negotiate buying his horse, and he indicated, he said, well, that didn't work. I wasn't going to sell my horse, but I didn't get my letter finished either, so it was delayed before I could do anything with it.
Did the Turner family also own the Flying W Ranch?
The ranching in that area ended up being. I realized that he was basically had the cattle on shares with his older brother. His older brother then came to the area in about 1887, 1888, and immediately he moved, of course, into his ranch, and became a county commissioner at that time, and Nathan Jasper was his name, and Nathan had a family consisting of 10 children, and we were able to track the movements of Nathan and as he traveled around the country where children were born, and several of them were born in Webster County, Missouri, and then the later children were born in Levita, Colorado, and then there was a child that was born, a girl that was born just about 6 months old before Nathan ended up stepping out of his home during the night thinking something was going on and fell over backwards in the wash and broke his neck and died with 10 children. Three of the children were boys. The oldest boy would have been Charles, although too young to really take over a ranching operation. However, they obviously kept the ranch. And in later years, then the three boys, which would have been Charles, Oscar, and Albert, and they then ranched in the Utah area and spent time in Fruita and in Grand Junction. The 7 daughters all married ranchers also, so they were very involved in ranching along the booklist from Thompson Springs to the Colorado border, along with their sisters and their husbands. They had quite an impact in the ranching out in that area. In the meantime, my granddad ended up getting married in 1892, as I mentioned, and we have a letter that was my grandmother Meddy in 1892 wrote to her aunt that lived in Hayesville, North Carolina, which we visited, and that's when we found the letter. And the letter stated that she and a fellow by the name of James Danny Turner got married and they were going to be moving to a home a big home, she referenced it, in western Colorado. And so the next time you write to me, you need to write to me in Fruita Colorado. And that was the first mention of Fruita Colorado as being home. And at that time, he put his cattle out on shares and was on a farm. So the area where the hospital is and all of this northern area was a strawberry patch that they planted. I don't remember. I think she said they planted 8,000 strawberries and some fruit trees, and he decided he was going to farm. And after about 2 years of that, he decided that he was going to go back into the cattle business. And it was about that time, which would have been around 1896, 7. He was able to start a company and buy more cattle, and then ended up with having a partnership with his brother William, still living in Missouri, and a fellow by the name of Fletcher, and that didn't seem to last very long until he then formed a partnership with Fred Matty. Matty Heights and Grand Junction would have been one of the developments or one of the projects that Fred Matty had. Fred was a saddle maker, and many people in the valley would have had Matty saddles and leather works. So Fred bought out the other two, and then they ended up going up on Douglas Pass, and there was a fellow by the name of Clark that had started a homestead on the East Salt Wash, or actually they called it East Salt Creek, and the homestead was on the entrance going into the canyon, at the mouth of the canyon, and they ended up then, Fred also did a homestead, and I have their little pencil sketch that they made, how they were going to lay the land out so that they would block the mouth of that canyon and control the canyon totally behind it. And so they had the 320 acres, 260 acre homesteads, and they homesteaded it around 1896, 7, somewhere in through there. But what happens? They delayed actually completing the homestead, so it was kind of in limbo. You had the process you go through. You had to file, and then you had to publish it. And once you get through the whole thing, then it's a matter of paying a fee, and then converting it into ownership. But at that point, no one else could come in and start filing on it. So I asked my dad, I said, why did they wait so long? Because they actually didn't file it until 1906, I think it was, 1905 or 6. And he said, the land was blocked or locked in, and once they had to pay the fee, which money was pretty tight, and plus they'd start paying taxes. So if they could stretch it out as long as they could without having to perfect it, they wouldn't have to be paying the fees or the taxes. So it was a justifiable way to do. And I might explain a little bit, because today we look at that and we are resentful of the fact that they're blocking off a lot of federal land actually behind it, and at that time it was all free range. It was before the Taylor Grazing Act, which was in 1930s, I think. But at that point, it was all whatever you could defend, you could graze on. And in many areas, the bigger ranchers would take advantage of the smaller operation and run their cattle right through, or trail their cattle right through another ranch's permit, or not permit, but property. Consequently, they wouldn't have the grass to support their own cattle then. So this was an ideal situation, because they could block all of the canyon, which consisted, of course, the bottomland up in the area there along the creek, plus Barrel Springs and Corral Canyon, Post Canyon. So there was quite a bit of range area that they could run, well run through the summertime. And then during the wintertime, when they bring the cattle down, they ended up then turning them out onto the desert, which it's hard to realize and to fathom that it would be possible for them to be able to range cattle, because to us it's a desert. At that time, my dad always would tell me, he said that the grass would have been up to the stirrup on the horse. And I've heard that many times. And even more recently, a book that I read of a rancher down in Utah, and he made comment that they originally were able to farm, that there was a farm north, as you can imagine, out on the desert from Moab. But all the cattle on the mountain would have been all of Douglas and all of the Book Cliffs clear out to Thompson Springs would have been pushed out on, the cows for the wintertime would have been pushed out onto the range. And even the cattle coming off of Pinyon Mesa and Glade Park were swam across now the Colorado River and into the desert. So there were thousands and thousands of head of cattle that would have been there in the wintertime. In the spring, they would start, and generally the Flying W provided the facilities for the roundup, and the roundup would start out at Thompson Springs and move across the desert. Every one of the ranchers would have to provide their own horses and men, and then they would start gathering cattle, and as they gathered the cattle, the individual ranchers would take the cattle and trail them on up to their ranch until they had come all the way clear through to basically to the North Fruita area. Even the areas, I understood that the ones that came off of Pinyon Mesa, they would swim across the river like it's Snook's Bottom or even out Westwater, if they had them by then. And they'd put them across on the south side of the river and trail them clear across the Redlands, in as much as there weren't any homes in there at all at that time. And then they would trail the cattle up on what we now, I think it's the Park Ridge, or it used to be the Jacob's Ladder route, up onto Glade Park, and then from the east end of the park up onto Pinyon Mesa. It kind of explains also that you needed to have a brand for both states. So Granddad had a Flying W brand for Utah, which was issued in 1896, and Fred Maddy then had the brand for Colorado, which both of them would be Flying W. So then they continued. So Grandpa, which everybody in the area called him Uncle Jim, so he ran the Flying W then, and Fred was just a silent partner. I doubt if very many people even knew that Fred was involved in the Flying W at the time. So then in 1917, Dad would have been 21, and Grandpa formed a partnership then with his son and Doc Gavin, which Doc's name was actually Harry Gavin. His dad would have been John Gavin, which John Gavin was involved in banking himself. Doc was a cattleman through and through. And so they set up an operation as a partnership, which was Turner, Son, and Gavin. And at that point, they then ended up buying the Lower Ranch, which was owned by Dr. Porter. And there was another 270 acres deeded land at that point, which would be the Lower Ranch and the Young's place. And Doc had homesteaded Spink, and so they added Spink into the operation. So they had deeded land basically all the way from the mouth of the canyon and Main Canyon, or Trail Canyon they called it, up to the Flying W, and then the East Creek running up through that area. So they had a pretty good setup, but it continued only 2 years. And then Grandpa ended up ill, and they decided to sell. And I always wondered why they did that when they had, they could have continued, I would think, in an operation as if Grandpa would passed away, which he did, they could have formed or continued their operation. They had borrowed money from Ed Young, which would have been the grandfather of Eddie Young, loaned the money to buy this other land and to pay off Fred Matty and take him out of the operation. But when it came time to make that decision, they decided to sell the ranch, and sold it to Ed Young and Dale Mitchell. And after years of realizing or questioning why that happened, I realized, which it took me about 80 years to come up to the conclusion, that my dad, Ernest, wasn't really interested in ranching. His younger brother, Jim, as soon as he got old enough, he left and went to Chicago to be a businessman. And I finally realized that I think that's what Dad wanted to do rather than being a rancher. And so that was more the reason. Doc, he was wanting to ranch, so when they sold the ranch, or sold the ranch then to Youngs and Mitchell, Doc took the cash money in the deal and bought a ranch up at Ridgeway. So he continued to ranch. And at that point, after Grandpa died that summer, my Aunt Nina, the oldest girl of the family, she and Doc married, and that's when they then moved up to Ridgeway. Dad moved to town, and Dad and Meddy then carried the note for the sale of the ranch to the Youngs and Mitchells. So they just kind of swapped. Ed loaned them the money to begin with to buy the operation, and then they turned around and carried the note for Ed for him to buy the whole operation. And so it was a good arrangement. Dad came to town and then went to Ross Business School. Now the issue of banking comes into the picture, and Grandpa owned stock in the first bank of Fruita, which was in the building on the south west corner Mesa around the Circle Park that has a bank symbol up on the front of the building. That was the first bank of Fruita. And Granddad was a director in that bank. And then when he passed away, his stock went to my dad. So Dad then ended up being a director from that point on. And after his business training at Ross Business School in Grand Junction, he then became employed working in the bank. Actually, I think he was kind of a part-time because he was also worked as a bookkeeper for an oil company. And so that continued until about 1928, and there was a big disruption called a depression that came on, and there were two banks in Fruita at the time, the First Bank of Fruita and the First National Bank, which the First National Bank was organized and was in at that time, would have been in the building on the other corner of the park, which is a Mid-Valley building now. and 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 they both ended up then not being able to survive the depression. The first bank was actually insolvent, and they had closed it, and then I think most of the assets were bought up by other banks in the junction. They certainly were for all of the First National Bank, and and so the interesting another item of interest in the problems at that particular point. If you were a stockholder or a director of the bank, you were liable for the loss of a bank, and personally. So, so they ended up. Their dad ended up being a part of a new corporation, which was, I think it was Town and Country something, land company. And this was a corporation that was formed with the directors that had been in the bank with him in the first bank of Fruita. And that was organized and set up so that they could take care of a continuation of the business. So if they had loans, all the depositors were guaranteed, so they were all paid off, all the depositors. But the loans some of them were bought and some of them weren't. And so there had to be some way to collect on loans that the bank had made or property that they had liens on. And so they formed this corporation to be able to handle all of those transactions. So that continued then for another 2 or 3 years, and what the recovery on that then would go to the stockholders, where they would have otherwise have a loss. They would at least get, I think they ended up getting like 50 cents on the dollar back after that. So Dad ended up going from that to ranching again. The Youngs were not in a position to handle it during the Depression either, as most didn't. And so they had made an agreement where Dad would go back to the ranch, and so they split it all up. And that's when Ed Young then took the ranch at the mouth of the canyon. Now you head up towards there, the first ranch you come to, and the canyon is the one that Ed took, and Mitchell ended up taking Spink, and then Dad and Grandma Turner, and the other daughter, Faye, who had married Ray Hayes. And so they then took the Flying W and ran it for a few years. And at the time then that Ray and Faye had children, they wanted to or needed to be closer to town for the kids to go to school. So they had a farm out on 16 Road, and Uncle Ray and Aunt Faye then ended up ranching, or not farming that land, and Meddy and my dad then ran the Flying W. So that continued on until the next chapter of life, in the game of life, and Dad was about 30 years old at the time, or no, 40 years old at the time, and still single, and had seemed to be inclined to go with the school teachers, and so it happened that the family home then was right on the corner of Cherry and Paper. right across to the west of the nursing home. And Mom was renting. She had gone to her family was the Austins, and they were very involved with the Brethren Church. My granddad coming here in 1904 from Oklahoma, from Cushing, Oklahoma, to join up with the group that were forming and building the Brethren Church, the little white church on the corner of Maple and Paver. And fact is, the block south of that, which goes down to Aspen, with the Catholic Church on the other end, Granddad Austin and a fellow by the name of Harmon plotted that that block, and Grandpa built a home that all of their kids, all the Austin kids, which would have been my mom, were born in the little house there on the corner, right across from south from the church. And so anyway, she then, when she finished high school in Fruita, as did my dad. He graduated, I think it was in let's see, 12, I think. I think it was 1912.
Yeah.
Or I don't know whether it's that or whether it was 15. But anyway, he graduated from Fruita, so did Mom. And she ended up then deciding to go to college. And she lived with her uncle in Denver and worked in Denver during the summertime, and then went to school in Greeley for a teacher. Well, in that time during the Depression, if you had 2 years of education, the school would hire you, and you could teach for 5 years, and at the end of the 5 years, you were a certified teacher. But there was a stipulation in a teaching contract at the time, at least in Fruita, and there probably was a state, and maybe more. But if you got married, you could not teach any longer. And so Mom had been teaching for 4 years because she was on that program, and she had an apartment across the street from the Turner House. And she was good friends of Fay Hayes. They were in school together, not in the same class, but I think a year apart. But they were good friends, and they would double date together. And Ray and Fay had gotten married, of course, and Mom was out working in the yard across the street, and Dad came and he kind of down on the mouth. He had been going with a school teacher by the name of Ruby King, and Dad was kind of down on the mouth when he came back, and he had taken Ruby to the train. Well, the deal was that, and Aunt Fay told me this story where the two of them were sitting in the nursing home looking down on the houses, and I had Aunt Fay tell me the story, which was that Dad came and he was kind of disturbed by the fact that maybe he'd made the wrong decision. But Ruby had told him that, they'd gone together for quite a while. She said, if you don't propose to me, I'm going to go to California. He said, well, I'll take you to the train. So that ended up, when he came back, he got to thinking maybe he shouldn't have done that. And Aunt Fay said, well, Beanie, he had a nickname of Beanie, and which evidently was a cartoonist like Dennis the Menace at the time, and everybody knew him as Beanie rather than Ernest. But she said, Beanie, why don't you ask Claire Austin over there? I bet she would be a good date for you. No, she wouldn't. She belongs to that Brethren Church, and they're pretty strict. They wouldn't care much about a cowpuncher. And she said, well, you don't know till you ask. So he did. He asked her, and 6 months later they were married. So that's where. So they got married, and Dad would have been 40 and Mom 30 at the time. and and they ended up getting married at 1 o'clock in the morning. They were out on a date, and he said, we should get married. And she said, well, I'm not going to get married on Saturday, if you mean tonight. So they waited until Sunday morning at 1 o'clock. Well, Dad evidently had had a reputation of being involved in too many people's chivarees. And if you aren't familiar with a chivaree, that was to surprise a newlywed and harass him or separate him or do ornery things to you. And so he was afraid everybody was going to catch up with him. So they got married early in the morning and took off, and their honeymoon was at Thompson Springs, at the hotel in Thompson Springs. That building's still there. I've gone out to see it several times. And then when they returned to Fruita, they went out to the ranch. Well, there were I think 2 different chivarees that were done to them out at the ranch. Pictures of them. One was a group of the church people, the Brethren, which was a pretty calm, nice affair, and the other was the Dad's friends. And the mom made comment. She said they stayed up all night, and she said if anybody would even think that they were or starting to tip off to sleep, somebody would set a firecracker under the chair and wake them up. She said it was pretty raunchy, but anyway, they survived it. So they spent just a short period of time and out at the ranch, because I think Dad decided, he told me that she didn't like out at the ranch, well, which I'm sure she didn't, because she did complain about being so far out. And at that time, even then, it was a pretty good trip from town in the cars they had at the time, because the road wound around through the hillside and down through the wash, and it was a pretty good journey. Not as bad as it had been when they went with the buggy. That was an all-day affair at that time. So he ended up then deciding to sell, or he and Grandma Turner. And so then they sold the ranch. I would have been about a little bit over a year old. And they sold the ranch to Dr. Jim Rigg in Grand Junction. Jim and his family enjoyed going out to the ranch hunting, and Jim found out after about 2 years that it wasn't as much fun being a rancher as it was being able to go out and enjoy the recreation of it. And that's when Young's then bought the ranch back again. So then it has remained in Ed Young to Iowa Young to Eddie Young. Eddie Young and I were a year apart. Ed was the same class as my sister, so we were friends and from the time we were little tiny guys. And I remember I retained the brand, the Flying W brand. It was in the name of Betty and my dad's name. And I just out of sentimental value, I continued with the brand for years. And I checked to see if I could get it transferred, but it was very complicated to do so. I had to open up the estate of my grandmother's and my dad's estate, and all the children of Medes, of course, would be affected also. And so I talked to my sister. I said, what do you think of me just giving it to Ed? And so I called Eddie up and asked him if he'd be interested in having the brand. He said, what would it? I said, I'd just give it to you. And so, of course, he could get it transferred a lot easier because they really wanted to have it as a working brand. But anyway, that was the story of ranching. Dad ended up back in Fruita. He bought the Oliver equipment, or the Oliver tractor equipment dealership in Fruita. And he bought the Cotico distributorship. So he had that, and the location would have been right on Aspen, next to the theater that we had at that time. Uinta Theater, and then later the Walker Theater. Fraser had it, did that. And anyway, he ran that operation there for a few years. And then there was a new bank coming to town, realized that they didn't, for all those years from the Depression, they didn't have a bank in Fruita. And so they decided that they would attempt to do so. And I think that, I don't know who was instrumental, but they got Jack Little to come from Denver over to just be the key to get it started. And at the beginning of it, there was, Dad was one of the stockholders and directors, and Emmett Elizondo, and Vern Huntley, which had at that time, the location of his clothing store was on the corner of where the bank then later became. And so Vern rented the corner to that new bank, and he moved his clothing store over to next door to him, and it continued there then just for a few years. But it was a Fruita State Bank, and they started it in 1946. And then in 47, there was a movement to move my dad in as the acting officer in the bank over Jack, and it was agreed upon. So Dad sold the Oliver Sales and Service to Earl Tompkins, and sold the Conoco distributorship to Lawrence Heide, and the agreement was that he would have a month's vacation that he wanted to take before going to work at the bank. So we went on a month-long trip, first to San Francisco. The Rotary International Convention was going to be held in San Francisco, and so there were 2 or 3 families that were going. Charlie Engelhart was one, he and his family, and I think the Moores. So we go to San Francisco and then up the coast, up to Oregon, Washington, over into Canada, in his 1937 Plymouth. And we had car trouble most of the way. Got into Canada and had a problem with the muffler. Well, they didn't have a muffler that would fit, so they finally jerry-rigged a muffler that was only about 2 inches off of the ground. And so as we came back into the States, we were stopped by police many times because of the fact that the muffler looked like it was falling off. But anyway, we finally got home, down through Yellowstone, a wonderful trip, and got home, and there had been a little bit of a power struggle with the bank. Well, it ended up that and it came down to kind of that Emmett and Dad, and then they brought Lincoln Coit, who was an attorney in the Junction, as a partner, and they made an offer of you buy or we buy, and changed the membership and the organization of the bank to be a little different than what they had thought that it was going to be. And then the directors then ended up being the 3 of them, and a fellow by the name of Charles Wilson and Wolfenbarger. Wolfenbarger was a contractor, builder, and Wilson had been the manager out at I think it was at the Garfield branch, Quaker Oats operation out on the desert. but he had retired and lived in Fruita at the time. So Dad was now back into the banking business, and that did well, and all was doing well until he ended up then with cancer. He had brought Earl Brumbaugh. Earl Brumbaugh had been the city clerk and had an insurance agency, and so Dad brought Earl in to work at the bank with him. And I remember Mary Etchemendy, I have a picture of, in 1951, they did a major remodeling. At the time they first had the bank, the corner of the bank was a setback so that the doors came right directly into the lobby, and the windows along the side of the building were all ceiling to floor windows like you would have for a department store. It wasn't so good for a bank. And so then in 1951 they remodeled the exterior bricking up the wall as it is today, and brought the corner of the bank out to an actual corner rather than a cutoff corner that it had been in the past. Added the area to the back, which as I recall, was Jack Oliver's barbershop at that time, and they included that part of the building into the bank, and also the part that was Huntley's clothing store into the remodeling of the bank, so it expanded the area considerably. So Earl and Dad and another woman that was Thelma Horton. She, I think, came from Kansas and married Weaver. But she was in the bank then for a while. And then Dad became ill, and they had an agreement between the three of them that if anything would happen to any of them, that the other would be able to, or would be offered to buy out the other estate then. Well, that happened to be the case with Dad, because when he passed away then, his stock was all sold to Emmett and Earl.
Tell us about your journey. How was it like growing up in Fruita? Take us along with your journey in growing up, and what made you decide where you were going in life, and your story.
My story would be that I thought I had no interest whatsoever to be in banking. I would go with my dad down to the bank, and there wasn't anything to do there but play with the stamps and shuffle paper. And I thought, what a boring life that is. And I enjoyed outdoors. I thought, why didn't you still have the Flying W Ranch? I thought that would have been wonderful. And so when I went to school and went to Mesa College for the first 2 years, and I was really dubious of what I really wanted to do. I had first gone into forestry, and I talked to people at the forest department, and they weren't encouraging at all. They said, "Oh, you need to go to geology." Well, I wasn't particularly interested in geology, so I thought, well, I'll just go to the service then to make a decision. Well, I talked to several past teachers, and they tried to talk me into staying in school. And I went down to see Earl, and Earl Brumbaugh, and Earl said, "No, Newt, I think maybe that'd be a thing for you to do. I think you should just go on to the service." I said, "Well, I'm in the middle of a term. I would lose that credit. I wouldn't worry about that. I'd just go into service." "I'm not going to do that." And so I told him years later that was really pretty tricky reverse psychology, and because it really turned me around. I forgot about going to the service because he didn't even argue. I expected Earl to argue with me about it, and he didn't. And he said, no, he said, it was just stupid requirement or stupid idea of mine. I shouldn't have said that, I guess. And a friend of mine had talked to his aunt, which was Marjorie Stout. She was a CPA, and my friend Monty Kelly, he was in the same predicament as I was, not knowing what to do. And she had suggested that that we take business classes, that we can always use business regardless of what you might end up as a special. So I thought, that's a good idea. Well, I did that, and I got into the finance at CU and decided that really was what I was interested in, the investments and finance. Ended up then getting a degree in finance. And Earl called and wanted to know if I'd be interested in coming back to Fruita. And I had married at that time, had a family, so I thought that would maybe really be an ideal place to be back in Fruita. And so in 1960, I returned to Fruita, even over the professor's advice that I shouldn't go to a small bank. That wasn't the thing to do. And I thought, to be back in Fruita, and I love in Fruita. Always enjoyed growing up in Fruita. It was such a pleasure, the freedom that you had in being able to do things. I was thinking about it the other day. I'd kind of forgotten about the nighttime alarm that went off, that their curfew, that you were supposed to be in at, I think it was 9:30 or 10 o'clock. I think it was 9:30. And also at noon. And so at that point in time, you really needed to hightail it for home, because Marshall was out there, might pick you up. Of course, you knew him. He'd say, well, what are you doing out here? And he'd follow you back to your home. But back to along the idea of the Marshall, I remember one time Dad had passed away in '54, so I would have been in high school. So I had a car to drive because Mom never drove. And so one of the few cars in the parking lot was mine. And so at noontime, I generally have a bunch of kids, and we go down and drag Main. And that was a big deal. Of course, you had to make a lot of trips to be able to get very far. And I remember this one time I pulled up in front of the school, and here was John Levitt, the marshal, pulled up in behind me. He didn't put his lights on me. He just came up behind me, walked up to the car, and I got out, and he said, I'm going to have to arrest you, Newt. I said, what for? Excessive driving. I said, really? I didn't know we had a law against excessive driving. He said, we don't, but he said, why don't you park that car? I'd probably really like to just be parked for a while. So anyway, that was the comfortable part of being in a small community and know everybody, and so anyway, that was a good choice. I was really glad to be able to return to Fruita, and ended up then the bank. Emmett, and I think Emmett particularly, he decided that it was time to do something else with it. And then it was bought by a fellow by the name of Leo Venditti, who had been a correspondent banker. He knew my dad, actually. But he and another individual had bought the bank. And I guess I'd have to say that we really didn't see eye to eye. And so when Earl decided to retire, and I had been in the bank, and I was next in line to be president of the bank, and Leo, he wasn't, he came up, I remember the evening after our board meeting, and he said, well, Don, we're going to have to get along and work together better, something like that. And I'd made comment to him before. I said, well, would you sell? Oh, I would never sell this bank. This is so dear to me. And so on Monday morning, first day, I get a call from him, and he said, I just want to introduce you to your new owners. So that's the way we started that relationship, and it ended up. And so then it was Jim Oliver and Ron Moore that bought the bank, and then they reorganized it. It was a part of a group of banks. Colorado was a unit banking state, which meant that you couldn't have branches, and it was so restrictive that even when they came out with new developments like a drive-up window and ATMs, they had to be attached to the building. You couldn't have a drive-up, across the alley. That was not permitted at the time. And so it was very restrictive. And of course, a lot of states were going with branching. And I would say, in that camp, believing that an independent bank is better for the community because you know that you've got to take care of your customers, because that is what keeps the bank going, just like in any kind of business. And to have a bank by you that is out of the area, totally, they typically have a inclination to take the deposits out, but maybe not be as generous in putting money back into loans within the community. And so the way Jim and Ron had planned this, as I look back, they had, I think, 5 other banks that were individually separate holding companies. And so they may be different investors, but they would be investors that they were basically instrumental in organizing. And anyway, it went on for several years, and I felt like the relationship was working well. I was still running my own bank, I thought, and they came in with an idea of changing the structure, and I didn't agree with it, and so I told them I think I better just move on. And at that point, I said, no, you need to stay. We're just wanting to bring in this other person that's going to be over you. And well, because I wasn't indebted to them. So anyway, it ended up, we had a meeting, and I resigned, stayed on the board until the end of the year. And I thought it ironic because Ron came up afterwards. He said, well, would you be interested in running Delta Bank? Why would I do that and leave here? Anyway, I discontinued, and I kind of was on the fence whether or not I wanted to stay in banking because I could see that what the trend was. And then a fellow approached me that had an option on a bank in Idaho and wanted to know if I wanted to go to Idaho. And so after about 2 or 3 trips up to northern Idaho, which was a little town, Troy, a smaller town, 500 people, a very vibrant little community, had a bank that was in the area, and the little bank in a 500 people community, but it served a large area, an ag area. Moscow's 12 miles away, which was a university of Idaho, and the bank was about 4 times the size of Fruita, surprisingly. But they had customers all over the United States and foreign countries, which was quite interesting. Anyway, it was supposedly a problem bank, and was an interesting experience. It was a wonderful experience. Remarried up in Idaho, and And after a number of years in Idaho, Key Bank came through and bought that, and I said, I'm not a big banker. I don't want to be into that aspect. So that was kind of the end of that. After leaving the bank, which I retired early then, and Ann and I were both interested in history, and we spent a lot of time doing genealogy, and then got my sister Patsy and her husband Walt Pollock. Walt was retired about that time too, so we would do family research for the Turners and the Pollocks and Ann's family, which was the Nielsen's, and we would plan trips. I think 7 years we had fall trips for about a month, and we would go to down into the south, up in Pennsylvania and New Jersey and Georgia. It was history plus it was a genealogy. So we would kind of cover both of those aspects then. And then when she passed away in 2000, my mom passed away in January, and we were in the process of making a move to Arizona from Idaho, and she passed away a silent heart attack, and in 2000, which would have been May of 2000, and after being snowbird back and forth to Arizona, and then in 2013, I decided I needed to go home. So I ended up then moving back, which 4 of the girls had been out of the area also up in the Pacific Northwest, and we all ended up going back to Fruita. So Fruita has its attraction back. It has been interesting after returning to Fruita, which I have over the years, coming down to spend time with Mom, as she was in Independent Village, and she was in Oaks and in the nursing home at various stages. And I couldn't help but recall as my time as an adult working in the bank and working and being president of the Chamber of Commerce and working in that for all the years that I was here, and what a struggle it was to try to build the community, trying to do it in a like the clothing stores, we would lose them, and although at one point there we had 3 grocery stores, but it was difficult seemingly to be able to compete with Grand Junction, and our retailers had difficulty competing because they couldn't buy in bulk, and so it was hard, and as a child, spending time over in the canyons. I spent 2 summers working up at Colorado National Monument, and I think what an asset we have there, and it really is not, hasn't been recognized as what it should be, although I don't agree with making it a national park, because then it gets overwhelmed with visitors then, and I don't know that we want to have that kind of an impact. But even over just across the river, I used to ride my bike over, go up Devil's Canyon, all through that area. Used to go over and visit John Condon, the fellow the hermit over there. Now I guess it's Springer that they've redone his little cabin, but so much assets around here and enjoyable hiking and biking and whatever, and then to see the trend and the fact that they followed up on the biking part, and has built a town. It used to be, I remember I'd go someplace and they said, where are you from? I'd say, well, Fruita. Oh, well, we don't know where that is. I said, well, near Grand Junction. And then when it got to the point that they'd say, where are you from? And I'd say Grand Junction area. And said, well, I know about Fruita, but I'm not very familiar with Grand Junction. I thought, they've arrived. So I am exceedingly pleased. I know that there's a mixed feeling, but to have either you grow or you die on the vine. And I felt like Fruita was dying on the vine. And so this was a revival, and I am tickled to death to see the impact of it. I volunteered down at the Welcome Center, and I love telling people that come through there, what our assets are, and where there's places to go if they're interested in the opera. This may not be the best place in Fruita, but if you're interested in hiking or climbing or boating or whatever, this is just ideal. The other day, I remember I'll go across the river and actually drove into the parking lot at Devil's Canyon, and 40 cars. It used to be you wouldn't see one car, but I think that it's really neat, the biking out on the desert. I think that is an ideal thing. Very pleased that they have retained the downtown area as it is, and it's very viable. You go down there on a Wednesday, and a Saturday crowd wouldn't be that big when I was still here until during the 70s and 80s. So I think that Fruita is on the right track. Frankly, I'm really pleased.